Germany has a history of perfectionism. This perfectionism was seen even in the uniforms of their SS killers. Hugo Boss is a fashion brand associated with wealth, prestige, and status, and is worn by countless celebrities. Yet, this fashion icon has done everything to protect its dark past from the public. So, who was this designer? Hugo Ferdinand Boss was born in 1885 in Metzingen, Germany, a town known for its textile industry. In fact, Hugo's parents owned a modest underwear shop, and so Hugo himself developed an interest in fashion from an early age. As a teenager, he took on jobs that would help him understand the industry better. He first began an apprenticeship as a merchant, then worked in a textile factory, and eventually took over his parents' business. Shortly after the outbreak of the First World War, Hugo had to serve in Germany in the war. Hugo survived the war but returned with a new vision that gave him a new meaning for his life. Instead of running his parents' small shop, he wanted to start his own fashion company, and so he turned the business into a tailoring shop, which he named after himself. As Hugo had already gained experience at a young age, it only took a few years before he was able to convert his business into a whole factory and then began selling his own jackets, shirts, work, and sports gears. His commercial training had made Hugo a good salesman, and soon the company's clothing was known throughout Germany. One of the consequences of World War I, however, was that Germany had to pay a huge sum of reparations to the victorious countries. The debt was set at 132 billion golden marks, which is an equivalent to around 300 billion euros today. This began to weaken the German economy, thus setting the stage for extreme hard and difficult times. While the US, the UK, and France were spending extravagantly at the expense of Germany's war debts. Germany was struggling to pay off war debts, whilst also not having money of its own for the country. As a result, German citizens were faced with high inflation and bankruptcies. And although Hugo Boss's clothes was very popular, his company began to suffer. No amount of reputation could change the fact that people could no longer afford these clothes. And then came the Great Depression, which even made the situation bleak. In Germany, even worse were food. Food became so scarce that families really had to ration, which was quite a very difficult time. So fuel and heating became something difficult in the winter months. To save his business, Hugo began to create uniforms for the German police and other government officials. Unfortunately, this was not enough, and Hugo was forced to lay most of his staff off and close his factory. Eventually, he declared bankruptcy, and all Hugo had were just 6 sewing machines. It seemed that the Hugo Boss clothing brand would only be a short-lived dream. Germany was in a desperate situation and was ready to accept help from anyone. During this time, Adolf Hitler came to power, but Hugo Boss saw this as a great opportunity. He knew that those to the Nazi Party were eligible for government contracts, and so he became a proud supporter of the Nazis, and from 1931 he became an active party member. Hugo made connections with high-ranking party members and knew that this would make him a prime candidate to produce the newly designed Nazi uniforms for the military, and it worked. He managed to make connections and eventually secured a contract to produce the uniforms with only 6 sewing machines. So Hugo set to work initially just to produce the Nazi uniforms, one of his first big contracts. This was to supply the Nazis with brown shirts. But as the party gained power, they needed more uniforms, such as for soldiers, the police, and the Hitler Youth. And Hugo's connections with the Nazis meant that he was soon able to produce uniforms for all of these areas to meet the growing demand. Of course, 6 sewing machines were definitely not enough. He needed a lot more equipment and employees. So Hugo Boss took out loans to expand his company, and from a financial point of view, Hugo Boss's loyalty to Hitler paid off massively. He earned a lot more money than his company could ever make. And when Hitler began to conquer Europe, Hugo Boss got additional help by using French and Polish forced laborers. For example, Hugo Boss had slave workers in his factories that produced uniforms for the party and the SS. Unlike some German entrepreneurs at the time, Hugo allowed his slave workers to at least eat in the canteen and not in the labor camps, and he is said to have made sure that they always got enough to eat at least. Conditions, and that Hugo threatened to send them to concentration camps if they complained or fell behind their work. As for Hugo Boss's personal beliefs, it is clear that public involvement with the Nazi Party was partly a strategic decision. Before Hitler came to power and Hugo formed an alliance with the Nazis, his company was in financial difficulties and he had little hope of success. However, a researcher who wrote a book about Hugo Boss came to the conclusion that Hugo joined the party not only because it brought him business, but also because he was a supporter of National Socialism and a loyal Nazi. It is reported that he even proudly hung a picture of himself with Hitler in his apartment. So although he may have partly gotten involved with the Nazis to save his business, it seems that when the war finally ended and the Nazis were defeated, Hugo Boss was investigated, and because Hugo Boss was exposed as an activist and financial supporter of the Nazi Party, he was banned from running a business in Germany. A few years later, in 1948, Hugo Ferdinand Boss died. So you would think that a company that bears his name will die with him too. Today, we of course know that that was not true, because till date, Hugo Boss is $1 million fashion. So what exactly happened? After Hugo Boss's death, what little was left of the company went to his son-in-law, Eugene Holy, who continued the company by producing uniforms for the police and the post workers. Even though the sale of uniforms kept the company afloat, the Hugo Boss brand was only a shell of its former self, because the lucrative contracts with the Nazis no longer existed. It was not until the early 50s that the Hugo Boss company was commissioned to produce suits. This was the decisive turning point for the company. The suits they made seemed to be very popular, and Eugene recognized that he was offering an opportunity to remarket the company and break away from the Nazi past. So Eugene started taking on more orders for suits to build a good reputation. Eugene made sure that the suits were elegant and made of very high quality materials, even though this was very expensive. The decision to produce suits with high quality standards paid off, as the Hugo Boss brand developed from a pure uniform brand to a real German fashion tailor, and so Hugo Boss quickly became a popular brand for men in Germany who wanted to wear stylish suits. Under the leadership of Hugo's son-in-law, Hugo Boss became a larger company than when the company was still run as a tailoring shop. Of course, the company did its best to hide the founders' political views and activism as best as possible, because they knew it would be disastrous PR if everyone found out the truth. It was a constant struggle to distance themselves from the founder and how much money he made by supporting Hitler. By 1969, the company was in its third generation leadership. However, Eugene retired and handed the company over to his two sons, meaning the company was now run by the third generation, and these two brothers were even more ambitious than their father. They were determined to make the company a global fashion icon. The two brothers who took over the company from the father began to market Hugo Boss as a pure designer brand for men, focusing on high-quality suits. Although selling such a small range of clothing may seem like a limitation, it allowed them to focus on the quality of their products. The result was that their products quickly gained a very good reputation. At that time, German suits were usually made from only materials from Germany, which were known to be a little stiff and heavy. However, the two brothers decided to break with this tradition and began to make suits from Italian materials, which were softer and lighter. They were modernized, and so were their factories, and they hired more workers to optimize their production. The changes made by the two brothers fulfilled their father's dream that Hugo Boss should no longer be associated with Nazi Germany, but with German quality and reliability. The brothers also did something that was unusual at the time, namely to manufacture some of their products abroad. Today, this practice is used by almost all large companies. But for a proud German company to move its production abroad was relatively unusual at that time. And not only that, since the company had now moved so far away from its original concept of producing uniforms and relatively inexpensive working gears, the brothers felt they needed a new brand name, and so they began to market the brand simply as Boss. The company seemed to do well under the two brothers' names. Their suits sold very well in Germany. Thus, the two brothers decided it was time to expand even further. They wanted to go global and sell to countries all over the world, but they knew they would have to invest heavily in marketing to become the globally recognized fashion company. The brothers made some good decisions. They invested a lot of money in advertising deals where they made the Boss logo part of, for example, racing cars of the greatest racing drivers of the time. This helped to increase the company's reputation outside Germany and led to the first Boss suit being sold in the United States in 1976. In addition, they also paid a lot of money to sign contracts with some of the biggest personalities of the time, such as Sylvester Stallone, who modeled for their suits and became the brand's face. Boss became, and their timing also was pretty perfect, because in the 1980s, the European movement began, in which more and more people aspired to become company bosses and entrepreneurs, and a stylish suit was an integral part. This movement, with the high-quality materials and the extensive advertising campaigns and advertising contracts, meant that Boss suits became very popular, and although they initially only focused on men's suits, this was already extremely profitable. But after they had cemented their place as a popular suit brand in many countries, the brothers finally realized that they could make a lot more money by expanding to other product lines. And so in 1985, they began to offer their male customers a lot more, such as the idea of selling their own perfumes, starting with the Boss No. 1 perfume for men. This perfume became one of Boss's most profitable products and was the start of what is now a huge fragrance business. A short time later, the company was listed on the German stock exchange, and in a matter of a year, Hugo Boss was worth more than all other German outfitters combined. But even though the brothers were becoming so successful with the company, they were exhausted and wanted to focus on something else after putting so much time into the business. So in 1989, they sold the majority of their shares to a Japanese company called Leighton House Group. The brothers still had some say in the company, and for a while, they were no longer responsible for sales and the day-to-day operations. It seemed like they were selling their shares at just the right time. Hugo Boss's incredible success was eventually cut short by economic instability. The Europe era was dying out, and economic turmoil in many of Hugo Boss's biggest markets in Germany and the United States made high-quality fashion less and less affordable for most people. In 1993, Hugo Boss's shares were trading at less than half the price the brothers had sold their shares for just over 4 years earlier. And as sales continued to fall dramatically, the new owners knew they had to act quickly to save the company. They initially split the brand into 3 business branches. The Boss brand would continue to sell high-quality suits, but they also created the Desarini brand, named after the chief designer of Hugo Boss, which would act as an explosive fashion branch, and finally a new brand called Hugo, which would target younger customers. They also offered some cheaper products to ensure that people could still afford their clothes despite the difficult economic situation. The company also tried to distance itself from all its masculine reputations and very soon began to sell clothes and fragrances for women. These restructurings actually helped the company to attract new customers, and by the late 90s, profits increased significantly. However, when CEO Peter Littman left the company in 1997, Hugo Boss went through a series of different CEOs who unsuccessfully tried to continue where Littman left off. Eventually, the chief designer of Hugo Boss, Werner Baldessarini stepped up to the top of the company and took over the board. He was initially hesitant to take the job, as several CEOs had already tried and failed, but eventually he accepted the task and was the one who decided that Hugo Boss should expand even further. So Hugo Boss started selling sportswear, casual wear, underwear, and even accessories like sunglasses. He also knew the impact of the brand's popularity and started working with the film industry to outfit some of the highest grossing films of the 90s and early 2000s with Boss branded clothing. Hugo Boss also got back into the modeling business and placed advertisements with some of the most famous models and celebrities of the time. With all these decisions, the brand consolidated its global success in the fashion industry. And of course, Hugo Boss is still one of the largest and most successful fashion brands today, whose products are sold in over 19 countries around the world. It is clear that Hugo Boss has come a long way from a small German tailor shop to a leading company in the fashion industry. The brand still enjoys a reputation for prestige and first-class design, and prominent personalities continue to model for the brand. Chris Hemsworth recently took over from Sylvester Stallone as a face of Hugo Boss. However, celebrity coverage of Hugo Boss has not always been positive. In 2013, Russell Brand received an award from GQ at an event sponsored by Hugo Boss. In his speech, he said, "Anyone who knows a little bit about history or fashion will know that Hugo Boss made the uniforms for the Nazis, and the Nazis were flawed, but they looked fantastic." Let's be honest, even though Hugo Boss is still viewed with skepticisms about its past, the brand has actively tried to correct some of its mistakes. In 1999, Hugo Boss set up a foundation to compensate its slave workers for their work and traumatic experiences during the Second World War. And in 2011, Hugo Boss issued a public apology for the first time in the brand's history, in a statement saying it was deeply sorry for those who suffered harm or hardship in the Hugo Boss operated factory during the Nazi regime. Hugo Boss is now proud to be involved in charities that focus on education and support in developing countries. With the original founder long dead and the company now owned by a completely different organization that seems to genuinely be trying to make a more positive impact, it raises the question of whether the atrocities committed by the original founder no longer influences how we should view the brand today. After all, it is a completely different company than it was back then, with very different values and management. So, ladies and gentlemen, this was the story of the fashion icon Hugo Boss and the company's disturbing past. If you would like to see more of such stories like this, then kindly click the subscription button and I will be back.